Well, good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, depending on which part of the globe you're joining from. We are very excited to hop on live here on the Gen X Dairy page to give a little bit of a debrief on everything related to genetics that came through with the most recent Sire summary, which happened last week. As people are all hopping on here, I'll take a minute to introduce myself, and I am joined by a very special guest on behalf of the Peak team as well, and I'll have him introduce himself as well. So once again, great to have everyone on here on this Facebook Live. We're going to deep dive into some of the changes that happened with the genetic proof run last week with August Sire summary. I am Leah James, the Dairy Marketing Manager at Gen X. And I solicited the expertise of a very genetic focused person to help answer some questions about what updates we're seeing. And that is Doug Bjelland on behalf of Peak. And I'll turn it over to Doug and he can introduce himself and share a little bit about what his role is within the Peak team.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. My name is Doug Bjelland. So I work within Peak R&D, which Peak is basically a sister or a companion company with Gen X. All of the bull housing, bull production, semen production type is housed under Peak, as well as kind of the Peak Genetics, which is the purchasing of donors, purchasing of bulls, creation of those sires that are marketed by Gen X. And then the R&D group is within that as well, which is a pretty small group. But we kind of provide some of that scientific expertise and data analysis for everyone within Peak, as well as with, sharing with Gen X as well. So my role within R&D is basically mainly data analysis related to the Peak female program. So trying to figure out exactly what we need to do in both short-term and long-term to try to continue producing top quality bulls for Gen X to market.
Excellent. No, that's a great background and great preference to Peak. And Gen X is excited to have Peak in our sister of companies to support our genetic product line. And as I mentioned, we're really going to jump into some of the changes that happened that all of you saw last week with the August proofs. I will preference that if you have specific questions as we're discussing proof changes, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer those as we go. We're going to kind of, as a preference, talk a little bit about the feed saved incorporation of some of the indexes in the industries, specifically lifetime net merit, preference a little bit about the feed saved trait in of itself, how it was incorporated into lifetime net merit, and then really how does that stack up when you're looking at the Gen X product line and selecting on our proprietary index ICC. So Doug, with that preference, as I mentioned, one of the big changes was the incorporation of feed saved into lifetime net merit. Feed saved was a trait that we saw go live, I believe it was last December, but with the April proofs, it officially got incorporated into lifetime net merit. Could you give us a little bit of a refresher of what is feed saved and what components feed into that trait?
Yeah, definitely. So feed saved, as we had said, was introduced earlier this year. Basically, it's a measure of feed efficiency. So there's kind of two different components. So one of them is body weight composite, and body weight composite has been around for several years in a couple of different kind of forms, but this has been developed by Holstein Association USA, and it's used as a measure of basically how big a cow is. And when relating this to feed efficiency, it's basically the idea and the research behind it is that, the bigger the cow is, the more it's going to require to eat to get to that size, and the more it's going to need to eat to maintain that body size. So with that, less percentage of that feed is going into, producing that milk. The other component is called RFI, or residual feed intake. This is the very new trait that had just recently come out after about a decade plus research trying to figure out exactly how we incorporate this into our selection goals. So this is basically measuring the difference between how much a cow actually eats versus what she's predicted to eat. So this is kind of the when you think about feed efficiency, this is probably the more kind of idea that comes to mind, is how efficient it is. Are they eating more or less while still producing the same amount of milk that we're expecting? So then with the feed save trait, it's basically combining both that body weight composite, combining that, hey, let's get a more moderate sized cow to doesn't require much to maintain it, and that RFI, get that more efficiency, eating less than we expect while still producing what we need. So that's a pretty important thing when talking about both feed saved and RFI, is that it's eating less, but still producing what we need. So I think a quick example with feed saved, if we take two bulls, say one's plus 200 feed saved, one is minus 200 feed saved, what that is telling us, that plus 200 is a more efficient animal. That's what we're seeing as more beneficial. The difference there is 400. So that plus 200, we would say his daughters we'd expect to eat 400 less pounds of dry matter per lactation than daughters from that minus 200 bull, while still producing that similar amount of milk.
Sure. Great example. I think that puts it in very good perspective from like a producer level. Obviously, feed costs are huge for producers. It's the number one cost on the farm level. So I think we've wanted a means to select for it genetically. And I think that's what came to tuition here in 2021. So great background on feed saved itself, Doug, but how was that incorporated into lifetime net merit here with August?
Yeah, so definitely both of those two components, that body weight composite and RFI, are included in the new net merit. Body weight composite had been in the previous one. Emphasis, selection pressure on that has increased with the new formula. And RFI has been basically just a new trait put in with pretty high emphasis within the new net merit formula. So both of those take up about, depending on exactly how you look at it, that 15 to 20% of the emphasis on that new formula. So basically kind of similar to Genix with rolling out ICC earlier this year, really pushing the industry towards more feed efficient, more moderate sized animals, which I think as Genix field staff, as people that I've discussed to on farms, that's what they're looking for in their cows.
Yeah.
So yeah, a couple other, go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point. And just as a point of conversation is that, yeah, feed saved isn't a stranger when you look at it from the Genix vantage point, and we'll get to that. But yes, we actually were the first in the industry to put as much emphasis and incorporation of feed save into our index within ICC with the changes we made in April.
Yep, definitely. And then just to mention a couple other changes within net merit. They included heifer livability in a small amount as well. And that one is basically measuring, the calf survivability, heifer survivability, making sure that those young animals can reach their first lactation into the herd. Another one was early first calving. So that includes both the reproductive aspect as well as the ability to mature earlier and be able to be bred and get into the herd sooner. With that, including more traits like the EFC, heifer livability, feed efficiency traits, they have to come from someplace. So a couple of the traits that got kind of decreased emphasis was that kind of more difficult economic aspect to measure in the functional type traits, so the udder, composite, foot, and legs. See quite a bit of decrease in emphasis on those.
Sure. Well, great preference. And once again, as we're discussing these changes, if some questions pop in your mind on changes that were made, please, once again, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get those answered. But to go back to the topic of ICC, Doug, when we're looking at the changes that were implemented here in August in lifetime net merit, how do they kind of compare when you're selecting on the ICC? Once again, the Genix proprietary index. Obviously, Doug, you've been very instrumental in helping us hone in that index, and were instrumental with the changes that we made here in April. So maybe just compare and kind of contrast what selection on ICC in regards to feed save points are compared to lifetime net merit.
Sure. Yeah. And when the Genix team went through their discussions trying to roll out ICC. Think it's for the most part, a very similar direction that USDA felt the dairy industry needed to move in development of net merit. So overall, it's very similar, but there are a lot of differences between ICC and net merit as well. I think a big one is within the feed efficiency traits. So one thing I didn't mention earlier, but most of you have probably seen, is that RFI is a much lower reliability trait than a lot of the other ones we work with. And that's essentially just because we don't have the decades and decades of milk production, reproductive data, type data that we do have with all of the other ones. It's just basically a decade worth of research herds that we can pull data to kind of predict our genetic values from. So when comparing ICC with net merit, ICC has a little more emphasis on that body weight composite, the more highly reliable portion of feed efficiency than that RFI. It still is included in there, and it should be noted that even if the reliability is low, as we mentioned, that economics is just potentially so important that even having it in at a low reliability has a very good high potential for the dairy industry as a whole and individual herds. Couple other differences we see are slight more emphasis on kind of the especially heifer health and heifer reproductive ability within ICC. And then kind of a really big one is, I had mentioned foot and leg composite, body area, udder composite, saw a slight decline within net merit, but it's still within there. Within ICC, we decided to go to a more selected, a more targeted approach for some of those type traits, just selecting where we felt there were pain points on farms that needed more current, faster correction than just kind of that generalized. So not including those two allowed us to put more emphasis on a few other health and longevity traits as well.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, great information. And I know maybe a question that is on the mind of viewers is, obviously these are all changes on the Holstein vantage point. I assume, obviously efficiency is being looked at across breeds, but is there any update that there would be any traits of efficiency similar, on the Jersey or any other breed vantage point?
Yeah, I'd imagine that's the goal. There hasn't been enough data developed on those other breeds to this to date. I think kind of with all traits, with the health traits that USDA had rolled out, it was Holsteins first, making sure we get that reliabilities and stability with that, and then potentially looking at other traits. Did roll out Jersey health traits. I would imagine it will be quite a bit longer with the RFI component.
Sure.
We have other breeds. We do have that body weight component and had similar increase in emphasis for Jerseys and other traits with that in the current updates. Sure.
Outside of this discussion of kind of obviously the big one being feed efficiency and the inclusion of feed saved, is there anything else that of interest that we should note that happened last week with August Sire summary, Doug?
I think one thing that is pretty evident to most people on the call is that most of the bulls probably look a lot better. The absolute value of the net merit increased quite a bit. It's not actually meaning that all of them got better. It's more just kind of, I would describe it as kind of an unofficial base change. So basically when USDA develops their formula, they don't put it on, try to set it on make it look similar to the previous ones, just go with the formula, what the numbers actually tell us. So everything looks a little better, not necessarily is. But even within that, we can look at how, specific bulls increase, decrease, or, how specific studs handle within that new index. And one good thing with Genetics is they look very, very good on that new net merit index. Basically, the average increase for marketed Genetics bulls went up much more than our competitor studs. And basically, this is just the type of bull that Genetics has been selecting for a long time. What Peak has been selecting and the type of bulls that Genetics has been drafting within Peak. It's that more moderate sized, feed efficient cow that can stay in the herd longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would reiterate that, Doug, you mentioned it. Obviously, Genex had an exciting proof run this time. Once again, ranked real well on the changes seen within lifetime net merit. But once again, no surprise, because we've had that proxy and that goal within ICC really from its inception. And obviously, we're first in getting that incorporated here in April. Excellent. A couple bowls that I was going to throw out. We've got bowls ranging across feed efficiency, but a couple very impressive ones that I know we've got a ton of availability is, I imagine curfew, 15517 curfew is probably one of the best in the industry. I have them at Feed Saved at a positive 440. I think that's pretty competitive as you're looking at an industry list. A couple new bowls that ranked really well on ICC and Feed Saved. Extremo is an early Alta Zazzle Sun. We're starting to see some of these Alta Zazzle Suns hit the lineup. And he actually comes in at over 300 feed saved, which is really pushing him up on that ICC rank all the way up almost to 1200 ICC as well. But I know there's some variance in product availability depending on what part of the country you're hopping on and sharing or watching today's too. So if you have specific questions on bowls, please feel free to reach out to us. You can do so once again in the chat here, as well as reaching out on our social media channels, or you can also hop onto our website, www.genex.coop. And once again, Doug has been awesome in fielding questions for us. So if you kind of have a next level genetics question, feel free to throw it at us, and I'll probably defer it to Doug, but we'll get it answered. So once again, Doug, thanks so much for joining us. I really enjoyed the time here sorting through some of this proof information. And yes, once again, feel free to reach out if you have questions. And thanks so much for joining.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.